Mr. David Shoebridge.
Oh, thanks, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Minister, for coming today.
Thank you.
Minister, do you believe that private development, particularly large subdivisions, should actually provide the necessary infrastructure so that communities can thrive?
Can I, in answering that question, and I welcome that, can I turn to briefly the success that this government has? We've had record building approvals, we've had record building commencements, we've got record constructions and completions across Sydney. We're developing new suburbs, vibrant suburbs,
But I'm asking you about the infrastructure, Minister, not the numbers. Do
No,
you believe
no.
those developers should provide the necessary infrastructure for communities to thrive?
Developers already provide, and yes, I do, together with government, and we've got a very strong position, this government, the amount of money that we are spending on infrastructure, creating a city through strategic consultation, through collaboration, ensuring we keep that local amenity and local character.
Lots of collaboration with developers, Minister.
Including community engagement. And again, I want to ensure that everyone here, that the planning and development occurs from an evidence-based approach, because it's important that we promote orderly development by integrating those social, economic and environmental considerations with regards to the principles of ecologically sustainable development. And of course, we'll continue to consider advice from independent organisations, because as a government, we will consider all proposals and policies that seek to enhance our urban realm, particularly those that enhance connectivity and can contribute to resilient communities. So whether we're looking at our vertical villages or optimised communities, our priority precincts, our priority growth areas, or housing for key workers, we're committed, and I'm committed as a Minister, to addressing that housing affordability challenge in Sydney and regional New South Wales, to ensure that that infrastructure goes in either before or concurrently as we develop these new communities.
Minister, that's perhaps the greatest collection of planning jargon I've yet heard in a single contribution. So congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Vertical villages.
Minister,
We've heard you go on every time.
Minister, do you know a property developer called Keith Johnson?
I've heard of Keith Johnson.
Have you ever met with him or representatives of the Johnson Property Group?
Well, can I say that my diary disclosures are made public, and I'd ask you to look there for all recorded
Simple
meetings.
question. Have you met with Keith Johnson or representatives of the Johnson Property Group?
My diary disclosures are made public, and I ask you to look there for all recorded meetings. But if you want to know, with respect to the contributions we take from developers to provide, that key infrastructure for these new communities, to ensure that there is that local amenity and local character, I'll ask Deputy Secretary Nelson to probably unpack that further.
Minister, my question was about meetings with Keith Johnson.
Well, I've answered that question, Mr. Chair.
Yeah. Minister, are you aware?
Your question was about,
Have you met with Keith Johnson or representatives?
No.
You're talking about an earlier question, Minister. We've moved on. Minister,
So you're saying that I answered that first question?
that was your jargon answer.
Yeah,
You remember?
that's good.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, I'm just surprised we accepted
This
it.
is all been
Minister,
so pleasant, David. You're taking the
Are you
standard
aware
down
that
here.
in October 2006, a planning agreement for land developed at Pitt Town was entered into with the then Planning Minister Frank Sartor, which provided, in $2006, a requirement for the developers, Keith Johnson and the like, to provide $16 million in infrastructure?
Look,
Jeez, you're going back a fair way.
in 2006,
I'll make it relevant soon.
I think I was probably Shadow Minister for, I think, multiculturalism or something at the time, or arts. Could have been arts.
Yeah.
But look, Marcus...
That was a high point.
Yeah, that was a high point. I know.
Yeah, Minister,
those were heady days.
Minister, can I indicate this is not a laughing... Minister,
Mr.
infrastructure
Chair,
in
Mr.
Western
Chair.
Sydney is not a laughing
Order,
matter.
Mr.
Are you
Chairman.
aware of the planning deed?
Order. The member allowed the witness to come through the chair.
It'd be lovely to be able to answer the question. You're happy for me to seek advice and answer the question?
Minister, you answer the question as you see fit. Are you aware of the agreement which required the developers to provide $16 million in essential infrastructure so Pitt Town could actually work?
I'll ask Deputy Secretary Nelson, who probably has got more information with respect to this. Again, it was before my time as Minister, it was before our time in government. Deputy Secretary.
Thank you, Minister. And yes, there was a VPA that was entered into at that stage, like many VPAs across the region. Soon after, there was a global financial crisis, and the then government made a decision to review the charges that were applicable in relation to all development contributions across the region to incentivise development to keep things moving and to keep housing supply on track. The decision was made some 8 years ago for that VPA then to be offset by 50%, and that was a standing policy position that the council made in relation, or that the state made in relation to VPA agreements. And so I think Mr Johnson's contribution was reduced to somewhere in the vicinity of $8 million, which he has completed the full payment of very recently, including the dedication of land for a new school.
Well, under that VPA, Mr Nelson, the
You
2006
can send the
VPA, through you,
questions through
Minister,
me. Thank you.
under that VPA, Mr Johnson and the companies associated with him made instead of paying $16.5 million, as they were legally obliged to, made the grand total payment of $375,000 to the Office of Environment and Heritage and a $2 million in-kind contribution for some school land. Is that right, under the original VPA?
That has since been updated. So Mr Johnson has in fact completed the obligations under his VPA earlier this year, and so his contribution was the equivalent of about 50% of what the original VPA amount, and that was consistent with all the decisions that the government had made in relation to encouraging development some 8 years ago at the time of the global financial crisis.
Minister, are you aware that Pitt Town residents, when they bought the approximately 500 lots that were developed by Mr Johnson and companies associated with them, thought that they were contributing $42,000 in developer contributions for essential infrastructure under the original VPA? Are you aware of that?
Mr Deputy Secretary.
So I understand that the residents of Pitt Town, Mr Shoebridge, felt that that was their obligation. We have, in fact...
Because there was a legally binding VPA, wasn't there, requiring Johnson to pay the $16 million?
If I can finish, we have had the contracts that those residents entered into reviewed legally, and there was no provision in those contracts which actually specified the amount that you've referred to. What the contracts did make reference to is the contribution that was applicable at the time payment was made.
Which was $42,000?
No, that was reviewed.
Point of order, Chair.
Point of order.
What we seem to be being asked about is arrangements made 8 years ago when either then Minister Sartor or then Minister Keneally was the relevant minister. Now, I know that the budget estimates are broad-ranging, but I haven't really seen budget estimates used for the purposes of cross-examining a current minister over the performance of a minister.
Don't you worry, Trevor. I'll make it very current very soon.
Well, you haven't got there so far.
Stop chewing up my time.
I saw four corners. Do you see the four corners episode on the Greens? Yeah. This is
Order.
This is not the unicorn.
Can we just
Greens.
focus on the purpose that we're at this inquiry for? Thank you. Mr David Shoebridge.
Minister, do you recall signing an amended deed in relation to the planning arrangements and the voluntary planning arrangements for Mr Johnson and his associated companies around Pitt Town?
Mr Deputy Secretary.
The Minister has delegated those powers through to my office, and those arrangements have been entered into.
So is it true that not in ancient history, but on the 5th of April, or thereabouts this year, under a delegation signed by you, Mr Johnson got a $10 million gift by an amended VPA that cut his contribution requirements from $16 million to just $6 million?
I reject the entire
Why do you
premise of the
give a
question.
developer a $10 million gift under delegation?
I reject the premise of the question. I think it is unreasonable. I think, quite frankly, you are better than that. But, Mr Deputy Secretary,
No, he's not.
There was no deal done this year that wasn't agreed to 10 years ago.
Was there a deed signed into in April which gave a $10 million cut to this developer?
There was, but it reflected an agreed position that was taken a decade ago, at which time the then government, made a decision across the board to reduce development charges by 50% to encourage supply during a period of very uncertain times for Australia.
Minister,
quite frankly, you'll be blaming me for the Vietnam War next.
No, Minister, I'm blaming you for the deed that was signed when you were planning minister in April this year, which gave a $10 million discount to a developer. Why would you agree to a deed giving Mr Johnson and his associated companies a $10 million gift?
We've already answered the question.